Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. I'm Cass B, and today we're going to be stepping into part 2 of our draping series. So last week, which would be part 1, we started with draping our fabric onto our dress form. So if you haven't gone ahead and checked that out, you may want to, but if you feel like you're pretty confident on how to drape fabric onto a dress form, feel free to start here. We're going to be taking our fabric panels and then transferring them into paper patterns, which we will ultimately use to create our garment. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so we're going to be starting with our bodice panels first, and let's just go ahead and do the front and then we'll do the back. So the back, goodbye, ciao. Let's talk about this front panel. So if you remember, we did it on the fold here, and that's just so that we have a really nice even center front seam. Great. And then if you remember our video prior, essentially we have this princess seam dart that kind of goes all the way up through the bust. If you've ever experienced pattern making before from a book, you'll know that there's dart distribution, but whenever you pinch these seams, essentially, because we've already sculpted it around the 3D panel that we need, we're going to just kind of trim that, and that's going to be where our new pattern shapes sit. So let's go ahead. We're going to remove our little pins so that we can see where our drawings, our markings are. So now that we've got it opened up, you can actually see how the pattern shapes are starting to take shape. So this cup panel itself will be 2 separate pieces, and we're just going to make our notches after we trim off this extra allowance so that they will fit together nice and smoothly. But before we cut everything off, we're going to add our additional measurements that, like I said in our first video, will make it to actually fit the person who will be wearing this. So before I cut these pieces, we're going to go ahead and add 1/2 inch to this outer seam here. We talked about this more in depth during our last video, so if you feel like you need to refer to part 1, please feel free to do so. So I'm just kind of making my notch, and then I'm just connecting that top panel because the bust was actually pretty perfect. I'm just flattening it. Don't worry too much about these lines because you're about to cut into them anyways. But think about that as our new line, and so we're going to be cutting there instead. So now we're going to go ahead and cut around all the edges. We're going to end up with our center front panel, we're going to end up with our side panel to our front, and then our 2 cut panels, as well as our little mesh insert right here. And you do that just because with deep V's it gives you a little bit extra structure, so let's go into it. So now we've got all of our panels separated, so we're going to say goodbye to our excess scrap fabric. Goodbye! Okay, so let's talk about each piece. So real quick, this is our mesh insert, making sure of course to keep the grain line straight up and down. This was the panel that just sat immediately below it. This is of course our cup pattern. These are really, really important to make sure you keep the grain line straight, which remember we had already drawn our grain lines. The only way that you will be able to avoid having extra wrinkling and all this fabric just smushing around extra places is to remember where the grain line is. So that's why we marked these. So we're going to go and just trace the outer edges of them with our pencil, and then we're going to add 1/2 inch seam allowance to each piece. So let's get that done. So I'm making really nice solid marks with my pencil so that I can see them. I'm just kind of going around the outer edges except for this curved part where I'll make a little dashed line instead. It's better to take extra time with your pattern pieces when you're drawing your lines to make sure that they're nice and clean and even instead of a rough sketched line, because whenever you start to add your seam allowance, you will notice it becomes ill-fitting if you don't have a clean line. You don't really even know where to cut. So I'm just going to kind of leave this a dotted line since it's the curved edge, or you can take a curved ruler and draw that out, but that's what we're going to start with doing. So I'm going to take my pattern piece and making sure that it still looks nice. I'm going to go underneath and mark the direction of my grain line. So even though it's from here to here, you don't have to draw it over here, but I think we're going to go ahead and do that just because that's where our pattern started. Don't forget to label everything as accurately as you can. So I'm signifying that this arrow points downward, so this is the waistline, so I know directionally the top from the bottom. I know that this is the grain line when I lay my pattern pieces out, and then I know that this is the bodice, side, front. because we already have a front panel, so we'll label that next. And then each piece, you're just going to go ahead on the outer edge and do 1/2 inch seam allowance, or some places do 3/8 inch, but I find that a little bit more seam allowance is better, because if you make a mistake, you have plenty of opportunity to fix it. Now on the top edge, usually you're only going to be doing 1/4 inch around necklines, but I like to just go ahead and add 1/2 inch again, just in case. And then I'm gonna loosely interpret where this dotted line is, kind of working my ruler around the edges. And then making sure that each of those intersection points are at a 90-degree angle, because that makes everything connect really nice. Okay, so we've got one piece done, so we're gonna apply the same method to all of these panels. Now I am going to be sure to mark certain sections of this, like I put CF on this line here so that I can remember that this is the center front line. And sometimes you can just open it up on a fold, but because of the insert of the mesh panel here, you're going to want to go ahead and add seam allowance to all the edges of this piece too. And then before I finish with this piece, I'm just going to go ahead and make a little mark right here, and that is to signify the mesh panel insert. More information versus not, it's never a problem. So if you feel like you're going to forget how to intersect your pieces, just make extra notes. Now I am going to cut this one on the fold because you don't want to see a seam down the middle of your mesh insert right in between the bust. So I'm actually going to cut it on the fold up here. So I'm going to draw little arrows up here and right here. I'm going to mark that that's the center front, CF. And so the only side that I'm actually adding seam allowance to is the outer edge. The cups are a little bit harder, but be very careful to really kind of go along what a smooth curve is for this, because otherwise when you go to intersect your fabric pieces for your cup, it won't go over the cup insert that we're using very flush, very smoothly. So just be careful to go all the way around these edges as smooth as you can. So I'm also gonna make a little notch for where my grain line is. I'm gonna connect that, and then this is gonna get 1/2 inch seam allowance as well. So I'm gonna label this cup A, and then I'm gonna label this side B, so that I know A goes towards the center front and B is the outer edge. You can label them whatever you want, that's just what I've always done. And I found that that works for me to be able to remember the direction and which way each panel is facing. It's very, very easy to get mixed up on the shape and direction of your cups. Okay, so with my pencil, you can kind of see that we've got our mesh panel insert, we've got our center front bodice panel, we've got our bodice side front panel, and then we've gotten our seam allowance added to all of those. We've also got our cups A and B, and now that everything is added seam allowance to it, we're gonna go ahead and move to our side panel for the back as well as the bottom pieces. So let's move on to that. So now we're going to be working on our back bodice panel. So we already did the front with the cup and where that goes and the insert and all that stuff. So now we're going to cut out our pieces that are going to go on to the back. So let's talk about where our new existing line should be. So we added 1/2 inch out here on the front side, so we're going to do that same thing, and then we're also going to add 1 inch to the center back. We're going to do this both to the top and the bottom because we can make final adjustments that'll bring it in nice and snug whenever we actually do our first fitting, but let's just go ahead and add a little extra. It's easier always to take it in. It's very, very hard to take a dress out. So let's go ahead and get on that. So we're adding 1/2 inch outward, and I'm making my new existing lines. We're gonna do the same thing to the back. So what we're gonna go ahead and do is add 1/2 inch to the center back section here. So I've opened up my seam that we originally started with, and I'm gonna add that 1/2 inch. And I'm gonna connect it, making my new existing line. Now that I've got my new lines, I've added 1/2 inch here and 1/2 inch here. We're just gonna go ahead and cut all the way around it. And we're gonna be sure to cut down this seam right here. That's gonna make a really nice princess seam that's gonna add to the overall fit. So let's cut it out. Okay, so now that we've got our pieces cut out, we're gonna do the exact same thing that we did to the front. We're pretty much just gonna trace everything. We're gonna mark our grain line. We're gonna add our seam allowance, and then we're gonna move to our bottom pieces. So now we're tracing around where we've made those little notches, getting the outer edges first, and then moving into labeling our panels, marking our grain line, and then doing any extra notches that we need. I always make sure to have an arrow just because when you get to these back panels, this rectangle gets kind of confusing when you're putting everything together. So I just make sure to add the arrow so that it points downward to signify where the waistline is. And then I make sure to put center back on the center back seam so that you don't accidentally sew your side seams as your back seam. So on my side panel, my side back panel, I'm going to go ahead as well and actually write side seam on this side so that I know that this, or actually I guess, so on my back side panel, I'm going to mark the side seam, which is going to be on this edge. Again, these rectangular pieces start to look very, very similar. So it's better just to mark your seams correctly so that you don't end up sewing them together opposite sides, upside down. So we're gonna go ahead and cut these out as well. Okay, so now we're going to be moving into our dress bottom panels. So first of all, we're going to make sure to mark our placement on the center front. So we're gonna go ahead and just draw a little bit more emphasis on our waistline. And then this is our side seam here, because actually what we want to do is curve it upwards a little bit. So the biggest thing is that we need to make our fit adjustments. So we had made a note that we need to add 3/4 inch to about right here. And then we made a note that we needed to add 1/2 inch to the waistline up here. So let's go ahead and do that. So I've got my ruler going out about 3/4, just right there. Now we have our new line right there. And then we're gonna add 1/2 inch seam allowance up to the top. And then we're just gonna connect those lines. And then, because we can, you might as well just add a little bit more excess down at the bottom so that everything kind of blends in together. And then we've already marked our dart placement, so we can go ahead and remove these pins. We can go ahead and trim off this excess around it and then trace our pattern piece. So we're gonna get to that next. Okay, so we've gone ahead and we've cut all of our excess off, so we're gonna go ahead and trace the outer edges. and add seam allowance and then making all of the notions of our marks. So now that we've got our skirt front all traced out and then added seam allowance to the outer edges, except for the center front, because this actually is going to be cut on the fold, so it's going to open up as one big panel piece. That's why we have seam allowance on the outer edges and not the folded edge. So now let's lay out our back skirt bottom and let's trace that out as well. Okay, so essentially exactly what we did to the front panel, we're gonna do to the back skirt panel as well. We're making sure to add our 3/4 of an inch on this outer edge. We're adding our 1/2 of an inch to this waist seam and this center back seam. And then we're gonna add it to the back here as well, and then trace all the way around. So let's go ahead and make our new lines and then we'll cut out the excess. I'm gonna go ahead 12 inches down from the center back, and that is where I'm gonna make my notch for my invisible zipper. I'm just finishing up with adding seam allowance to everything. So now that we've got our skirt panels all the way drawn out, we're just gonna cut these out just like we did our bodice panels, and we'll go from there. All right, so now that we've got all of our pattern pieces cut out, they're all finished, we've got all of our seam allowance, this is essentially how they should look, at least for the way that we draped it on our dress form. Okay, y'all, thanks for tuning in to our 2-part series for draping and pattern making. Don't forget to head over to my Instagram page, Caspi by Design, if you want to see this look actually come to life. And don't forget to like and subscribe, of course. And if you have any comments or suggestions, feel free to leave those in the comment section as well. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next time.